Hey guys, it's Miss Arlequin, and in this video, we are going to be talking about the introductions for our Lord of the Flies symbolism theme essays. All right, so we know that an essay follows a very specific structure. And the introduction in particular is like the top of an hourglass, meaning we start out being very general, just like the top of an hourglass is really wide. And then as the top of the hourglass goes down, it gets narrower and narrower. And that's the same thing in our essay. Our essay gets more narrow, meaning it gets more specific. There are three parts to our introduction. There is the engaging lead, aka the hook. That's when you hook your reader in and you make them want to keep reading. You're catching their interest. There's some other things that the hook and the lead has to do. We'll talk about that in the next few slides. Once you've gotten their interest, then you have to slowly start to become more specific. So there's a couple of sentences, could be one, could be two or three, where you start to connect the ideas that you talked about in your lead to your thesis statement. In order to do this, you have to already know what your thesis statement is going to be. You can't save that for last. So knowing what your thesis is, knowing what you're going to be writing about in the rest of your essay, you got to slowly start to inch your way towards that. That's why in the lead, you don't really talk about the author or the book title. You save that for the middle part of your introduction. And then you finally get to your thesis statement. That is the sentence or sentences that tells your reader, this is the point, or these are the claims that I'm going to be making in this essay. In other words, this is what I'm going to prove in my essay. So, in addition to thinking of it as the top of an hourglass, you could also think of that introduction as an inverted triangle, right? It's the same kind of idea. The shape on top is very wide, and as it goes down, it gets narrow. All right, so your introduction should do three main things, right? It has to get your reader's attention and interest. It has to basically introduce them. That's why it's called an introduction. You're introducing them to what your essay is going to be about. So that is the topics of your essay, the specific author, the specific book, some of the general ideas of what you're going to go into detail about in the body paragraphs. It's always a good idea to once again begin your intro very generally and then get to your focus thesis statement. So the first thing we start with is our hook or our engaging lead. Now, catching somebody's interest is the main part of your lead, but there's also a couple of other things that part of your intro should do. You want it to be general, so once again, you're not mentioning specific book titles, characters, or plot events. You also want it to be related to what you know your essay is going to be about. If you're going to be writing about the savagery within man, even though Lord of the Flies also talks about civilization, you might not want to go into too much detail about civilization in your intro if the main focus of your essay is going to be savagery. You also want to think about prior knowledge, right? When you first start reading something, it's always easier for you to understand what you're going to read if you already know a little bit about the topic. That's why in class we always do pre-reading activities to kind of get our brain started to build background knowledge if we don't know anything about the topics of the book. And so you want your reader of your essay to do the same thing. You got to activate their knowledge, get them thinking about, in this case, savagery, civilization, whether or not humankind is naturally evil. And if you think that your reader might not know a lot about those topics, these are a couple of sentences where you could start to give them a little bit of background. So, of course, there's a lot of different strategies for engaging your reader. Of course, the easiest one is, an open-ended question. But now that we're getting ready to graduate and go on to high school, we really want to start thinking about more sophisticated leads to go into our essay. So I would fall back on a question if I really can't think of anything else. But more sophisticated strategies would be beginning with a quote, something from a famous president or famous author that's related to the theme I'm going to be writing about. So in this case, things about human nature and man's capacity for evil. An imaginative scenario, that's a really great way to get your reader interested because you're asking them to put themselves into the situation. If I'm going to be writing an essay that talks about descending into savagery, then ask my reader to imagine what they would do if they were in a situation where savagery was tempting them. You could tell your reader an interesting fact. Not really an appropriate strategy for this essay, so I would probably skip it. Or, again, you want to build background knowledge. You can write some general statements, definitions about your topic, what most people think and feel about it. How do most people view mankind and human nature? What is savagery? What is civilization? What's society? Define it. That could be part of this kind of strategy of general statements. Imaginative to scenario, again, is really engaging, and it can build a little background knowledge, although not as much as the other strategy of giving a definition and general statements. This one's probably more of the engaging one, and you can see an example of it on the right side of the screen. Comes from, of course, my favorite story, The Chaser. Or you can, again, go with the general discussion on the topic, or, again, highly engaging, the quote. So when you're thinking about your hook sentences, you got to really know what you're going to write your essay about, because your hook has to come off of what you know your essay is going to be about. So what is your thesis statement? What is it that your essay is going to be about? What points are you going to be making in the body paragraphs? You can draw from that. What knowledge should your reader begin to think about before they think about the specific characters and events in the book that you're writing about? I know that if I was writing a thematic essay about the chaser, obviously they need to have a little knowledge about what the chaser is about, John Collier, love, irony, suspense, right? The way irony is used to develop the theme, or the way that the story uses suspense to develop theme or to show character. Definitely love is a big thematic element of that story, the main theme. In Lord of the Flies, easy. We've talked about this over and over. We're talking about savagery. We're talking about civilization. We're talking about fear, the power of fear. We're talking about the ability to maintain order when you are facing fear and savagery. The ability to maintain hope when you are facing fear and the temptation of savagery. All of those, depending on which specific theme you're going to be writing about in your book, are really great starting points to introduce your reader to your essay. So, what can I do? If I'm going to be writing about the conch, for example, and I know that I'm going to talk about how order fades away because savagery took over, I can find a quote about what it means to give in to temptation, right? Because that's what the boys do. They give in to temptation. They give in to their inner darkness. And if I start with a quote like that, I can then tie it into how whatever the quote is telling us about these things, how it relates to Lord of the Flies. So that's one way I could go about it. If I'm writing about, on the other hand, Piggy's glasses, well, obviously I know that if I'm writing about Piggy's glasses, I'm going to be talking about probably mentioning technology, but we know Piggy's glasses mostly represented rational thinking and the ability to see clearly and to use logic. So my quotes would probably be more along those lines. Now, what if I wanted to do an imaginative scenario? Now, the most literal one would be to say, imagine you needed glasses and somebody stole them from you. Boring. Think a little bit more general, a little bit more deeper. Again, symbolically, the glasses represent the ability to see clearly. So get your reader to imagine a scenario where they start to behave irrationally, or they start to see things, their perspective is kind of messed up or skewed. They're not able to see clearly. Ask them what might be causing that. Why might their rational behavior start to become irrational? What are some of the reasons? So now we're kind of getting to the causes of behavior. What are some of the reasons why people start to become irrational? That's a beautiful tie-in in your essay to where you're going to talk about the specific characters and why they started to become irrational. So once you've got your lead, you now have to slowly start to get more specific, right? Remember, up until this point in my intro, I've not mentioned book title or author. I got to start to do that now. So when you connect your lead, you're just transitioning, you're bridging a gap between the introduction and the thesis. If I mention the author's name and the book title here, that is one less thing I have to do in the thesis statement. Once I mention the author's name, I also don't have to mention his full name anymore. I can start to refer to him by his last name. So there's a couple of ways that you can start to connect the lead to the thesis. You can introduce the specific author you're going to be writing about and tell a little bit about him. This is usually a good strategy when you're writing about multiple texts from the same author. William Golding, a British author from the 1960s, was inspired to write the novel Lord of the Flies after witnessing the atrocities that took place during World War II. Then I might say a little bit more about the author here, just so that I connect to my thesis. He wrote about the atrocities. My essay is going to be about descending into savagery. So I might say something like, he feared that man could too easily become a savage. And then that could lead into my thesis where I say, in Lord of the Flies, he explored children and their capacity to become savages. And then that's going to lead me into my thesis. Now, I could also just introduce the specific story, which is usually one of the best strategies, especially if you're just writing about one text. It's also the easiest one to do, because this is where you're giving just a summary of what the story is about, a sentence or two. In William Golding's novel, Lord of the Flies, a group of schoolboys end up stranded on an island. As time progresses, darkness begins to take over. And then my thesis could be through the use of symbolism, through the use of the conch, blah, 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 what the theme is. Or finally, just introducing a little bit more general, the genre that you're going to be writing about, the types of story that you're going to be writing about, or stories. There are many texts that deal with the darkness that lies in man's heart, right? Very general. William Golding's Lord of the Flies takes it a step further by focusing on children. Or one such novel is Lord of the Flies. Again, this is the perfect strategy when you're writing about more than one author or more than one type of text. When you're just writing about one book, strategy number 2 is always going to be your best bet. All right, and then you just come to your thesis statement. Again, we've worked on these in class. They're basically your claim. It's the point you're going to be making and proving in your body paragraphs. You always want to make sure, if you haven't mentioned the title, and even if you have mentioned the title, it's always kind of easy to start your thesis with the title of the book. You need a strong verb that kind of analyzes what the book is doing or what the author is doing, and then what your claim is going to be. So for the Lord of the Flies essay, again, we have written our thesis already, but if you didn't like it or you wanted to revise it, you're going to have something like this. Thesis should always have a little context, the subject, and the claim. In his novel, Lord of the Flies, Golding uses the symbol of the conch to show that order cannot be maintained in the face of savagery. In Lord of the Flies, Golding includes the image of a fire dying to make a claim about the impossibility of hope standing firm in the face of fear. I don't know, I'm thinking of these off the top of my head, but you can see the pattern, right? Some of them work better than others. Probably image isn't really the best one for symbolism, although the image of the fire, if it's really descriptive language with your symbol, that could be good. You can also play on these. You don't have to use them exactly. When we wrote about the theme in our books and how they connect to a symbol, we use these sentence frames. And of course, we talked about how this would make a good thesis as well. All right, so now it's time to write your introduction. I hope the video was helpful. Remember, there's always additional handouts and video links from older videos from previous years that you can use to explore this topic a little bit more if you're having trouble.